So erythrocytes have a lifespan of approximately 100 to 120 days, which is roughly 3 to 4 months. So recall that the erythrocytes have no nucleus and they have very few organelles. So this means that they cannot make new proteins, new plasma membranes, and they can also not undergo mitosis. What they end up doing is they circulate in the bloodstream until they break apart and disintegrate. They tend to fragment in very small capillaries, specifically capillaries within the spleen, which is often referred to as the erythrocyte graveyard. So the body doesn't just waste the damaged erythrocyte parts, instead it recycles them. In particular, it recycles the hemoglobin protein, and so hemoglobin is split into the heme groups as well as the globin proteins. One of the critical components that's removed is iron, and iron is removed from the heme group and is used in the production of new erythrocytes. So globin, which is a protein, is broken down into its component amino acids, and then those amino acids are released into the bloodstream, so the body can use those to construct brand new proteins. Iron is removed from the heme group, and it's placed on protein carriers, which will release them and carry them through the bloodstream. The iron can then be reused when new red blood cells are created by erythropoiesis. The remainder of the heme group is degraded into a pigment that's called bilirubin, which is then picked up by the liver. So the liver will then release bilirubin along with bile into the small intestine when the liver is stimulated to release that bile into the small intestine because of its function in digestion. Once that bilirubin makes its way through the small intestine into the large intestine, we see that bacteria in the large intestine will convert bilirubin into another pigment called stercobilin. And stercobilin is a brown pigment that is what gives fecal material its characteristic color. So let's take a moment and examine some disorders of erythrocytes. One of the major erythrocyte disorders is referred to as anemia. And anemias are any condition in which the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is too low. This could come from too few red blood cells, too little hemoglobin, too little iron in that hemoglobin, or it could also be a result of the insufficient production of erythrocytes. So most of the anemias will show the same basic set of symptoms, things like fatigue, chills, and shortness of breath. So let's examine some of the primary causes of these anemias. First, we have hemorrhagic anemia, which is caused by massive blood loss, such as open wounds, lacerations, ulcers that are bleeding, and things like this. The term hemorrhage simply refers to bleeding or blood loss. The typical treatment for hemorrhagic anemia is a blood transfusion where the lost blood is then replaced. Next, we have iron deficiency anemia, which is typically a secondary result of hemorrhagic anemia, but it can also result from inadequate dietary intake of iron, or it could also result from the impaired absorption of iron from the foods that we consume. Next, we have pernicious anemia, which results from insufficient vitamin B12 absorption. The primary cause of pernicious anemia is actually an autoimmune disease that destroys the inner lining of the stomach, which is referred to as the mucosa. So the reason that the stomach mucosa is important in this case is that the stomach mucosa produces a substance that's called intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is secreted from the stomach into the small intestine during digestion. And intrinsic factor has to be present in the small intestine in order for the small intestine to be able to absorb vitamin B12 from the foods that we've consumed. Next, we have renal anemia, which is caused by insufficient production of the hormone EPO, which is erythropoietin, from the kidneys. Aplastic anemia is an anemia that's caused by the destruction of red bone marrow. This destruction of red marrow could be caused by drugs, certain chemicals, things like X-ray radiation, as well as certain viruses can result in or can cause the destruction of red bone marrow. Next we have hemolytic anemia, and hemolytic anemia is caused by the premature destruction of red blood cells. Hemolytic anemia can occur as a result of transfusion of mismatched blood, because the immune system will destroy the mismatched blood, or it can also be caused by infection by malaria parasites. Part of the life cycle of the malaria parasite involves a stage in which it reproduces in our erythrocytes. When the parasite reproduces in the erythrocytes will rupture and burst when they become filled with their parasite hosts, or with their parasite load. Roughly 250 million people per year are infected with malaria, and roughly 1 million people per year die from the infection. And these infections and deaths are primarily occurring in the tropical regions of Africa as well as Southeast Asia. Our final anemia is referred to as sickle cell anemia, which results from the production of abnormal hemoglobin. This is a genetic condition that's inherited, so that means that we cannot obtain this at any part in our life. We have to be born with this condition. And what occurs is that the body produces the hemoglobin protein incorrectly. A single amino acid in the amino acid sequence that makes up the protein hemoglobin is replaced. The image in this slide is showing a normal hemoglobin amino acid sequence, as well as the normal shape that the red blood cell takes. In the next slide here, we have a sickle cell. And with sickle cell anemia, a single amino acid in the sequence of amino acids for hemoglobin is substituted for another one. And this substitution has very important consequences. So when the hemoglobin unloads its oxygen at the tissues, the abnormal hemoglobin changes shape, and it causes the cell that's carrying that hemoglobin to change shape as well. And in doing so, it takes on a sickle-shaped appearance. Abnormal hemoglobin is much more stiff than normal hemoglobin. This causes the red blood cells to fracture and fragment more easily. And with abnormal hemoglobin, we also see that the cells, the erythrocytes, are not as elastic, which makes them less flexible. These sickled cells, because of their stiffness, will then tend to clog up small blood vessels. And we see that tissues will begin to die if they are not receiving proper blood flow, because the blood, of course, is delivering oxygen and nutrients that tissue needs. The dead tissue will often cause pain in addition to being subject to frequent infections. Nerve endings will begin to die as well, which causes someone suffering from sickle cell anemia to experience chronic pain. So finally, we are going to examine a condition that is the opposite of anemia, and this is called polycythemia. Polycythemia is defined as an excess of erythrocytes. So a quick question would be, would an excess of erythrocytes cause a high or low hematocrit? If your answer was a high hematocrit, you'd be correct, because excess erythrocytes would increase hematocrit. And when hematocrit increases, we also see that blood viscosity increases. So this means that the heart has to pump harder in order to move that high viscosity, that high stickiness, that very sticky blood. Because remember, that viscosity means that the blood has increased in its stickiness and it becomes more syrupy. There are two types of polycythemia. The first is called polycythemia vera, which is the result of a type of bone marrow cancer. And polycythemia vera can increase the hematocrit up to 80%, which is almost double the typical hematocrit, making the blood extremely viscous and causing the heart to pump much harder as a result of that high increase in viscosity. The other polycythemia is called secondary polycythemia, and this typically occurs when living at high altitudes, because at high altitude the atmospheric pressure is much lower, which causes oxygen to diffuse into the bloodstream less easily. And so, as a result, the body responds by increasing the hematocrit. We also see that secondary polycythemia is observed in extremely well-trained endurance athletes. So people like professional marathoners or professional ultramarathoners will often see some mild secondary polycythemia as a result of their endurance training.